Mike with OT Defense here. Going to go over a real quick stippling do's and don'ts. It's not rocket science, but some people make it out to be, and then some people way overthink it. If you're competent enough to handle a firearm and not shoot yourself in the leg, you should be competent enough to deal with a wood burner and moving some plastic around. But if you don't feel comfortable with it, obviously take it to someone who is comfortable with it. So first off, don't over stipple. Some people get a frame and they get a stipple kit and they just think, I will stipple everywhere that's plastic because, you know, bigger is better and more is merrier. Not necessarily the case. A, because you can't remove stippling, and B, because you don't need to stipple everywhere. And the most important part, if I was going to choose the only 2 square inches to stipple, would be the front strap, because that's where you get the most grip out of. Next would be the back strap, and then next would be the outside. Concealed carry guns, I might not stipple this side at all. I might cut it off right about here and then here on the back so that it doesn't rub against my body, but I still have an aggressive texture for where my shooting hand grabs. Don't go too deep. Some people just bury the wood burner and the tip into the frame. You don't need to do that. Of course, make sure you practice before you start stippling and recognize that different materials are going to react different. Your Glock is going to be a different material than your SIG, which is still different than a Magpul PMag. So practice on a PMag and you look at it and think, man, this looks horrible. And then you go to the case that your Glock came in, or some of our practice material, and you think, wow, this looks way better. It's because it's more similar to what the Glock itself is. Glocks, XDs are a very similar material. Smith & Wesson M&Ps, the back straps are like butter. You could put a wood burner into it, press the tip in, and then smear it with your finger for 20 seconds thereafter because it's such a soft material. The frame itself on the M&P is more dense than a Glock, but not so much as a PMag. HKs and SIGs are a little bit more dense than a Glock, but again, not as much as a PMag. So you just need to practice with that and practice on multiple materials so you know how a material is going to flow as soon as you touch into it, and you can adapt accordingly. This is a Glock specific tip, but not a bad idea to do on any frames. Put a taped magwell, or taped magazine, into the magwell to prevent it from warping as you press into some of these spots where the material's thin, and if you feel on the inside of most Glocks, it's already got a little bit of an indentation. You don't want to hold constant heat to that as you're stippling and then not be able to drop your magazine because you made a compressed area there. So I take some foil tape, you could use blue painter's tape as well, and then tape it up and then put a little bit more on the sides so that it's a snug fit into the magwell. I'm going to draw lines on this with a pencil. Another option would be to take some foil tape and cut it and make the radiuses that you want, and even add it to the bottom and make your straight lines, and then that gives you a hard line to go up against. And this, if it's thick enough, does provide a little bit of a safety buffer if you stipple on the tape. I'm just going to use a pencil. Overall, stippling is somewhat tedious, but is possible for a lot of people. Definitely know your limits. Know that if you're not good with your fingers and don't have good eyesight, maybe stippling isn't for you. And if you're not very patient, the basket weave tip probably isn't for you, but there's numerous other tips that you could knock out a Glock in a short period of time, as we'll see here. Now that we've got the basics out of the way, I'm going to draw some lines on this with a pencil, and I'm just going to eyeball everything. I'm going a little bit below the factory texture, but the factory texture itself, and then simply connecting the textures, is another really simple, easy way to do this. And some people would use a straight edge, blah, blah, blah. The limit is your imagination. Do what you are comfortable doing to get the best results. And obviously, if you don't like your line, erase them and redo it. You can always make changes and modify things until you start flowing plastic. I can always go up a little bit more, add a little bit more later, depending on the tip, of course. Certain tips, you don't just add more to it easily because it's part of the planned pattern. For instance, the basket weave tip, you don't just add 1/8 of an inch of it because it's a bigger tip than that. But now I've got the lines drawn where I want everything. I'm going to follow the factory texture across the top right there, and tape mag is inserted and ready to stipple. This is the Thorns tip, new for July of 20. Square on the edges, so I'm just going to go around the perimeter, my pencil line, literally doing no borders or anything with this particular tip. And you can see that it still leaves a pretty decent pattern. A lot of guys get so caught up in the borders and they're not actually good at borders and therefore make their project look horrible because they tried to do something before they were skilled enough to accomplish it. So keep that in mind. Don't overdo it and try something just because some guy made it look cool on the internet if you're not capable of it or practice enough for it. And this particular tip is used at random, so it's actually really nice for no prep work. I don't need to sand this down and make the frame weaker and thinner than it is already because I'm just moving material rather than removing the material. So this tip is used at a random rotating application and it'll blend in everything really well. Certain tips do of course take prep work, for instance the basket weave tip or the diamond tip, you know, something that you want a really distinct pattern. I would take a Dremel tool and sand this down. But wagon wheel, X-tip, micro diamond tips, waffle tips, I wouldn't bother with prep work on like a Gen 4 Glock. On a Gen 3 or like the original XD by Springfield Armory, those bigger humps, I would take a flat tip and flatten all those things out just to give you a more solid base to go to. Some folks would just Dremel it off, and that's a personal preference thing, of course. But there you can see how that looks by simply randomly rotating it. So as you start stippling, sometimes you'll notice the tip isn't leaving as shiny as a texture on the bottom of the imprintation of the tip itself, because obviously we're just putting a reverse image onto the frame. So if you start noticing it gets a little dull, it's because you're losing heat. So just slow down a little bit or take a break for 20 seconds and let the tip build up some heat again. Certain people will just use a hotter burner. I generally use a 30-watt wood burner. That's always an option. For this video I'm using a 25 because this is what I recommend most of my customers start with, because it's a user-friendly heat and not as easy to make mistakes because it's about 100 degrees less temperature. I use my pinky finger to kind of control me on the frame. Just a little bit of depth control. And I feel that it locks me in. Done the border here. You can see just going up to a pencil line. And then when I come in with this particular tip, it's just a random application, so I can eliminate that symmetry. So you'll notice I didn't even fade this in. I'm just using the texture itself and pressing down a little bit harder and just going to blend that in, and you won't be able to tell that it wasn't sanded down afterwards. Sometimes if you notice the material's not flowing right, just take a brass or copper wire brush. Don't use stainless steel because it's harder than the tips are since they're brass, and give it a quick swipe across it. Alternately, you can just let the material burn off by holding it off the frame for a few seconds. One point of note is colored frames, you're either going to have to move quickly so that you don't let material have the chance to start burning off and turning black, or you're going to have to do 1 to 2 presses, wipe it off every time. Obviously it depends on the tip. Way more problematic with a waffle tip than say the oval tip, but definitely something to keep in mind if you're going to stipple a tan or green frame. So, since this will happen to some of you, we'll go over this. You can see my pattern isn't as crisp here as it is on the other side. That's because I started to lose a little bit of heat and just kept going too fast and had a little bit of buildup on the tip, so it wasn't given as crisp a pattern. So I took a break for a few minutes and come back to it, and now I can continue, and you'll see the difference in what just 2 minutes of being off the burner does as far as the crispness of the pattern. And obviously this varies depending on what tip you're using. So in that picture you can see the benefit of taking your time. So I'm going to go back over some of this and fix the remainder so that I have that crisp, shinier pattern that I'm looking for. And again, this is not something that you can do with just any tip. So beginners, you should probably start with a beginner tip. So pros will a lot of times have multiple wood burners, and that is a way to keep the constant heat and have that crisp pattern all the time without having to back off for a little bit. Some guys will have 3 of them plugged in at a time on their bench and just switch them out every few minutes. For the average user, if that's cost prohibitive, then you can simply take a little break, leave the wood burner sitting on its stand or in a safe spot, and then resume. Some folks like to remove the humps. You can use like our cutting tip and actually just peel underneath it and take it off, or Dremel tool it off. I'm just going to leave it there. You'll notice I'm rotating this tip every so often just to keep the pattern completely randomized. So there's the final product. It's hard to see in this, but there's a couple spots that went a little bit too deep and didn't get as crisp as a pattern as I wanted. So I'm going to go over that once I let the burner get a little bit more heat, just to blend those in a little bit better. See, just going to the pencil lines, taking it slow, practicing, getting your straight lines, and then blending the entire pattern.